Richard Blackwood stood at the top of the grand staircase, his eyes surveying the opulent ballroom below. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the guests, their laughter and chatter rising like bubbles in a champagne flute. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a joyous occasion marking his son Alexander's engagement to the beautiful Maria Vasquez. Yet, as Richard adjusted his silk tie, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. "Dad," Alexander's voice cut through the crowd. "Come down and meet Maria's parents. They've just arrived." With a practiced smile, Richard descended the stairs, his hand gliding smoothly along the polished mahogany banister. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, ensuring every detail was perfect for his only son's engagement party. The Blackwood estate had been transformed into a fairy tale setting, with garlands of white roses and twinkling lights adorning every surface. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Richard's eyes fell upon Maria. She was a vision in a champagne-colored gown that shimmered with every movement. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, and her olive skin seemed to glow in the ambient light. She was undeniably beautiful, but it wasn't her beauty that caught Richard's attention. It was the ring on her finger. Time seemed to slow as Richard's gaze fixed upon the glittering diamond. His heart began to race, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The world around him faded into a blur of muffled sounds and indistinct shapes. All he could see was that ring, a ring he knew intimately, a ring he had last seen 15 years ago on the hand of his beloved wife, Elizabeth. "Mr. Blackwood?" Maria's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Are you all right?" Richard blinked, struggling to focus on the young woman's concerned face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind was reeling, grasping for an explanation, any explanation, for how his late wife's ring had found its way onto the finger of his son's fiancée. "Dad?" Alexander's voice was laced with worry. "You look pale. Do you need to sit down?" Without a word, Richard turned and strode towards his study, leaving a wake of confused murmurs behind him. He needed space, needed to think. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he leaned heavily against it, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The ring. How was it possible? He had buried Elizabeth with that ring, a final token of his love resting eternally with her. Richard closed his eyes, and unbidden, memories of that fateful night 15 years ago came flooding back. It had been raining, the kind of relentless downpour that turned the world into a gray blur. Elizabeth had called, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite place. She said she needed to tell him something important, something that couldn't wait. Richard had been in the middle of a crucial business meeting, but the urgency in his wife's tone had compelled him to leave immediately. He never made it to their meeting place. Instead, he'd received a call from the police, informing him that Elizabeth's car had been found at the bottom of a ravine. The official report ruled it an accident, a tragic consequence of treacherous road conditions. But Richard had never been able to shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Now, as he stood in the dimly lit study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the ghosts of the past, that old suspicion roared back to life. The ring on Maria's finger wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a key to a mystery he had long tried to forget. Richard's mind raced with questions. How had Maria obtained the ring? Did she know its significance? And most chillingly, what did this mean for the circumstances surrounding Elizabeth's death? A soft knock at the door jolted Richard from his reverie. "Dad?" Alexander's voice was muffled through the heavy wood. "Is everything okay?" Richard took a deep breath, straightening his posture and smoothing down his jacket. He couldn't let his son see his distress, not tonight. This was Alexander's moment, and Richard was determined not to ruin it with the spectral remnants of the past. "I'm fine, son," he called out, infusing his voice with a warmth he didn't feel. "Just a momentary dizzy spell. I'll be out in a moment." As he reached for the door handle, Richard made a decision. He would say nothing tonight, would not mar his son's happiness with his suspicions and fears. But tomorrow he would begin to unravel this mystery. He would find out how Maria had come into possession of Elizabeth's ring, and in doing so, perhaps finally uncover the truth about his wife's death. With one last steadying breath, Richard opened the door and stepped back into the party. a forced smile on his face and a storm of questions raging in his heart. As he made his way back to the ballroom, he caught sight of Maria laughing with a group of guests, the diamond on her finger catching the light and seeming to wink at him mockingly. The evening stretched on, a blur of toasts and congratulations. Richard played his part perfectly, the proud father beaming at his son's happiness. But beneath the surface, his mind was working overtime, planning his next moves, considering who he could trust with his suspicions. As the last of the guests departed and the cleaning staff began their work, Richard stood alone on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. The cool night air did little to calm the turmoil in his mind. He pulled out his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "Jack? It's Richard Blackwood," he said quietly into the phone. "I need your help with something. Discreet. It's about Elizabeth. I think there's more to her death than we thought. Can you meet me tomorrow?" As he ended the call, Richard's gaze drifted back to the twinkling lights of the party, now being extinguished one by one. In the morning, he would begin his search for answers. But for now, in the quiet of the night, he allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, a single tear sliding down his cheek as he whispered into the darkness. "Oh, Elizabeth, what really happened to you?" The morning after the engagement party dawned gray and overcast, matching Richard Blackwood's turbulent mood. He had barely slept, his mind a carousel of memories and questions that refused to slow. As he nursed his third cup of coffee in his study, the events of the previous night played on repeat in his head. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he called, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Alexander entered, still in his pajamas, his usually immaculate hair tousled. "Dad? Are you okay? You left the party so abruptly last night." Richard forced a smile. "I'm fine, son. Just a bit overtired from all the excitement." Alexander didn't look convinced. He perched on the edge of the leather sofa, concern etched on his young face. "You know you can talk to me if something's bothering you, right?" For a moment, Richard was tempted to unburden himself, to share the weight of his suspicions with his son. But the memory of Alexander's radiant smile as he introduced Maria to the guests held him back. How could he taint his son's happiness with the ghosts of the past? "Of course, Alex. It's nothing, really. Just the usual pre-wedding jitters of a father," Richard lied smoothly. "Speaking of which, how's Maria this morning? I hope she enjoyed the party." Alexander's face lit up at the mention of his fiancée. "She's over the moon, Dad. She couldn't stop talking about how perfect everything was." He paused, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Though, she did mention that you seemed a bit off when you met her parents. Is everything all right between you two?" Richard's grip tightened imperceptibly on his coffee mug. "Everything's fine, Alex. I was just a bit overwhelmed by the moment, that's all. Maria is a lovely girl, and I'm thrilled to welcome her to the family." Satisfied with this explanation, Alexander stood up. "That's great to hear, Dad. I'm meeting Maria for brunch later. Would you like to join us?" "Not today, son. I have some business to attend to. But you two enjoy yourselves," Richard replied, already planning his next move. As soon as Alexander left, Richard picked up his phone and dialed. "Jack? It's time. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." An hour later, Richard found himself in a dimly lit booth at the back of O'Malley's, a nondescript pub on the outskirts of town. Despite the early hour, a few regulars were already nursing their drinks at the bar. Richard nodded to the bartender, who wordlessly placed a glass of scotch in front of him. The door creaked open, and a man in a worn leather jacket slipped inside. Jack Murphy had aged since Richard had last seen him, his hair now more gray than black, deep lines etched around his eyes. But there was still a sharpness to his gaze that spoke of a mind as keen as ever. "Rich," Jack greeted him gruffly, sliding into the booth. "It's been a while." Richard pushed the glass of scotch towards his old friend. "Too long, Jack. Thanks for coming on such short notice." Jack took a sip of the scotch, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "Your call last night, you said it was about Elizabeth. After all these years, what's changed?" Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "The ring, Jack. Elizabeth's ring has resurfaced. Jack's eyebrows shot up. That's impossible. We both know she was buried with it. I know what I saw, Richard insisted. Last night, at my son's engagement party. His fiancée, Maria. She was wearing Elizabeth's ring. The very same one I gave her on our 10th anniversary. Jack whistled low. That's one hell of a coincidence, Rich. Are you sure it's the same ring? There are plenty of diamond rings out there. Richard shook his head vehemently. It's not just any ring, Jack. You know that. The setting was unique, custom-made. The way the diamonds were arranged. It's not something you'd find in any jewelry store. It was Elizabeth's ring. I'd stake my life on it. Jack leaned back, his expression thoughtful. All right, let's say it is the same ring. What are you thinking? That there's a connection between this Maria and Elizabeth's death? I don't know, Richard admitted. But it can't be a coincidence. Elizabeth dies under mysterious circumstances, and 15 years later, her ring shows up on the finger of my son's fiancée? Something doesn't add up, Jack. Jack's eyes narrowed. Rich, we went over this 100 times back then. The police investigation, the accident reconstruction. Everything pointed to a tragic accident. Are you sure you're not seeing connections where there aren't any? Richard slammed his fist on the table, causing the glasses to rattle. Damn it, Jack. You were there. You saw how devastated I was. But you also know I never fully accepted the official story. Elizabeth's phone call that night, the urgency in her voice. She was trying to tell me something important. And now this ring shows up? It can't be a coincidence. Jack held up his hands in a placating gesture. Okay, I hear you. So what do you want to do? What do you want me to do? Richard took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. I need you to dig, Jack. Use your old contacts, call in favors if you have to. I need to know everything about Maria Vasquez. Where she came from, her family history, how she met my son, everything. And most importantly, I need to know how she got that ring. Jack nodded slowly. It won't be easy, Rich. A lot of time has passed. Trail's probably cold. I know, Richard said, his voice tinged with desperation. But you're the best there is, Jack. If anyone can uncover the truth, it's you. Jack downed the rest of his scotch and stood up. I'll see what I can do. But Rich, be careful. If there is something to this, if Elizabeth's death wasn't an accident, you might be stirring up a hornet's nest. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Richard's eyes hardened with determination. I have to, Jack. For Elizabeth, for the truth, and for my son. If there's even a chance that Maria is connected to Elizabeth's death, I need to know before Alex marries her. As Jack left the pub, Richard remained in the booth, lost in thought. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. He was risking everything, his relationship with his son, his family's happiness, perhaps even his own safety, on a hunch. But the image of that ring on Maria's finger burned in his mind, demanding answers. Over the next few days, Richard found himself walking a precarious tightrope. On the surface, he played the role of the doting father, enthusiastically participating in wedding preparations and getting to know Maria's family. But beneath this facade, his mind was constantly working, analyzing every word, every gesture from Maria, searching for any hint of deception. He observed Maria closely during family dinners and outings, looking for any slip that might reveal a hidden connection to Elizabeth. But Maria remained the picture of innocence, charming, intelligent, and seemingly devoted to Alexander. Her laughter was genuine, her affection for Alexander apparent in every touch and glance. And yet, the ring glittered on her finger, a constant reminder of the mystery that lay beneath the surface. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Richard decided to probe gently. Maria, that's a beautiful ring you're wearing. It looks quite unique. May I ask where you got it? Maria's hand instinctively went to the ring, a soft smile playing on her lips. Oh, it's a family heirloom. My grandmother gave it to me before she passed away. She always said it was meant for the day I found true love. She gazed adoringly at Alexander, who squeezed her hand in response. Richard felt his heart rate quicken. A family heirloom? That couldn't be right. He had personally designed that ring for Elizabeth. Unless Maria's family was somehow connected to Elizabeth's past? The possibilities whirled in his mind, each more outlandish than the last. "Your grandmother must have had exquisite taste," Richard commented, keeping his voice neutral. "It's remarkably similar to a ring I once gave my late wife." For a split second, Richard thought he saw a flicker of something in Maria's eyes. Surprise? Recognition? Guilt? But it was gone so quickly he couldn't be sure he hadn't imagined it. "Oh, what a lovely coincidence," Maria exclaimed. "Perhaps they were made by the same jeweler. Wouldn't that be something?" The conversation moved on, but Richard's mind remained fixed on that moment. Was it truly just a coincidence? Or had he glimpsed something more sinister behind Maria's carefully constructed facade? As the days passed, Richard found himself increasingly torn between his growing suspicions and his love for his son. Alexander was happier than Richard had ever seen him, his eyes lighting up every time Maria entered the room. The young couple seemed perfectly matched, their love palpable to everyone around them. But the ring remained, a constant reminder of unresolved questions and buried secrets. Richard's nights were plagued by vivid dreams. Elizabeth calling out to him, her voice lost in the sound of screeching tires and shattering glass. He would wake in a cold sweat, the image of the ring burning in his mind. A week after the engagement party, Jack finally called. "Rich, I've got something. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." Richard's heart raced as he made his way to O'Malley's. As he slid into the booth across from Jack, he could tell from his friend's grim expression that the news wasn't good. "What did you find?" Richard asked, his mouth dry with anticipation. Jack pulled out a thick file and placed it on the table. "I did some digging on Maria Vasquez. On the surface, everything checks out. She's who she says she is. Grew up in a small town about 3 hours from here, went to college on a scholarship, met Alexander at a charity event 2 years ago." Richard felt a mix of relief and disappointment. "But..." Jack leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But when I started looking into her family history, things got weird. Her grandmother, the one who supposedly gave her the ring, I can't find any record of her existence before about 20 years ago. It's like she appeared out of thin air." Richard's brow furrowed. "What are you saying, Jack?" "I'm saying that Maria's family history might be fabricated. And there's more." Jack hesitated, seemingly reluctant to continue. "Go on," Richard urged. Jack took a deep breath. "I managed to track down an old photo of Maria's grandmother. Rich. She bears a striking resemblance to Elizabeth." Richard felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. That's impossible. Elizabeth didn't have any living relatives. She was an only child, and her parents died years before we met." "I know," Jack said quietly. "But the resemblance is uncanny. Take a look." He slid a photograph across the table. Richard's hands shook as he picked it up. The woman in the photo was older, her hair gray and her face lined with wrinkles. But the eyes, those were Elizabeth's eyes staring back at him. "This can't be," Richard whispered, his mind reeling. "Elizabeth died in that car crash. We buried her. I saw her body." Jack's expression was grave. "Did you, Rich? Did you really see her body, or did you just see a closed casket?" The implications of Jack's words hit Richard like a physical blow. Memories of the funeral flooded back, the closed casket, the insistence of the authorities that the body was too damaged for viewing. At the time, consumed by grief, he hadn't questioned it. But now, what are you suggesting, Jack? That Elizabeth faked her own death? That she's been alive all this time? The words felt ridiculous even as he said them, and yet a part of him clung to the impossible hope they offered. Jack shook his head. "I don't know, Rich. But something isn't right here. The timing of Elizabeth's death, the mysterious appearance of Maria's grandmother, the ring. It's all connected somehow." Richard slumped back in his seat, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. If there was even a chance that Elizabeth was alive. But then, why would she have abandoned him and Alexander? And what did it all mean for Maria? "What do I do now, Jack?" Richard asked, feeling more lost than ever. Jack's eyes were filled with sympathy as he replied, "You've got a choice to make, Rich. You can let this go, accept Maria into your family, and try to move on with your life. Or, Richard prompted, Or you can keep digging. Try to uncover the truth, no matter where it leads. But I'm warning you, Rich, if you go down this road, there's no turning back. And you might not like what you find at the end of it. Richard stared at the photograph of the woman who might be Elizabeth, his heart torn between the desire for truth and the fear of destroying his son's happiness. As he sat there in the dimly lit pub, the weight of his decision pressing down on him, he knew that whatever choice he made would change his life, and the lives of those he loved, forever. The ring on Maria's finger, once a symbol of love and commitment, had become the key to a mystery that threatened to unravel everything Richard thought he knew about his past, his present, and his future. As he left the pub that night, the cool evening air doing little to clear his troubled mind, Richard Blackwood stood at a crossroads, torn between the pursuit of truth and the preservation of his family's happiness. Little did he know that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of his world, leading him down a path of shocking revelations, heartbreaking truths, and ultimately, a confrontation with a past he thought long buried. The decision weighed heavily on Richard Blackwood as he drove home from O'Malley's, the city lights blurring into streaks of color outside his car window. Jack's revelations about Maria's mysterious grandmother and the uncanny resemblance to Elizabeth had shaken him to his core. The possibility that his wife might still be alive, that she had orchestrated an elaborate deception, was almost too much to bear. As he pulled into the driveway of his expansive estate, Richard noticed a light on in Alexander's study. Despite the late hour, he felt an overwhelming need to see his son, to reassure himself of the tangible reality of his family amidst the swirling uncertainties. He found Alexander hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of wedding magazines and sample invitations. The young man looked up as Richard entered, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Dad, you're up late. Everything okay?" Richard forced a smile, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. "Just couldn't sleep. Wedding jitters by proxy, I suppose." Alexander chuckled, gesturing to the chaos on his desk. "Tell me about it. Who knew there were so many shades of white? Maria's been amazing through all of this, though. I don't know what I'd do without her." The mention of Maria sent a jolt through Richard. He studied his son's face, seeing the unmistakable glow of a man deeply in love. How could he risk destroying that happiness based on suspicions and half-formed theories? "Son," Richard began, his voice hesitant, Are you absolutely sure about Maria? About this marriage?" Alexander's brow furrowed in confusion. "Of course I am, Dad. Why do you ask? I thought you liked Maria." Richard backpedaled quickly, realizing his mistake. I do. She's lovely. Marriage is a big step, you know? I want to make sure you're ready." "Dad," Alexander said, his voice softening, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Maria is. She's everything to me. When I'm with her, it's like I've found a piece of myself I never knew was missing." The sincerity in Alexander's words struck Richard like a physical blow. Whatever the truth about Maria and her connection to Elizabeth might be, one thing was clear. His son's love for her was real and profound. "I'm happy for you, son," Richard said, squeezing Alexander's shoulder. Truly. As he left Alexander's study, Richard's resolve hardened. He would continue his investigation, but he would do it discreetly. He couldn't risk hurting his son unless he was absolutely certain there was a threat. The next morning, Richard called Jack. "I need you to keep digging," he said without preamble. "But we need to be careful. If there's even a chance that Elizabeth is alive, that she's connected to all this somehow, we can't risk tipping our hand." "Understood," Jack replied. "What's our next move?" Richard took a deep breath. "We need to find out more about Maria's grandmother. If she really is Elizabeth, or somehow connected to her, that's our best lead." "Can you track down an address?" "I'm on it," Jack assured him. "But Rich, what are you planning to do if we do find her?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But I need answers, Jack. For my sake, and for Alexander's." Over the next few weeks, Richard found himself living a double life. By day, he played the role of the doting father, enthusiastically participating in wedding preparations and getting to know Maria's family. But in the quiet hours of the night, he pored over the information Jack sent him, piecing together a puzzle that grew more complex with each new revelation. Maria's grandmother, he learned, lived in a small town called Millbrook, about 3 hours' drive from the city. According to local records, she had moved there some 20 years ago, right around the time of Elizabeth's supposed death. The coincidence was too glaring to ignore. As the wedding preparations intensified, Richard found it increasingly difficult to maintain his facade of normalcy. Every interaction with Maria was colored by his suspicions, every smile and gesture scrutinized for hidden meanings. He caught himself staring at the ring on her finger, his mind racing with unanswered questions. One afternoon, as they were finalizing the seating arrangements for the reception, Maria caught him looking at the ring. "It really is beautiful, isn't it?" she said, holding out her hand to admire the sparkling diamonds. "I still can't believe Grandma gave it to me. She always said it was her most treasured possession." Richard's heart raced. Here was an opportunity to probe, to perhaps uncover a clue. "Your grandmother must have quite a story behind that ring," he said, keeping his voice casual. "Has she ever told you where it came from?" A shadow seemed to pass over Maria's face, so quickly that Richard almost missed it. "You know, it's strange," she said slowly. "Grandma never really talked about her past. Whenever I asked, she'd just say that some stories are better left untold." The cryptic response sent Richard's mind spinning. Was this evasiveness evidence of a deeper deception, or simply the private nature of an old woman? "That's intriguing," Richard said, struggling to keep his voice neutral. "I'd love to meet your grandmother someday. Perhaps she could come for a visit before the wedding?" Maria's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I'm not sure that would be possible. Grandma doesn't travel much these days. Her health, you know." Before Richard could press further, Alexander burst into the room, full of excitement about a new idea for the wedding. The moment was lost, but Richard's suspicions had only grown stronger. That night, unable to sleep, Richard made a decision. He needed to see Maria's grandmother for himself, to look into her eyes and know, once and for all, if she was truly Elizabeth. The next morning, he told Alexander and Maria that he had an unexpected business trip. "I'll only be gone for a day or two," he assured them. "Don't worry about the wedding preparations. I trust your judgment completely." As he drove towards Millbrook, the landscape changing from urban sprawl to rolling countryside, Richard's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Hope, fear, anger, and confusion battled for dominance. What would he do if he came face to face with Elizabeth after all these years? What could possibly explain her abandonment of him and Alexander? Millbrook turned out to be a picturesque small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Richard checked into the only hotel in town, a quaint bed and breakfast run by a chatty elderly couple. "Oh, you must be here to see old Mrs. Vasquez," the proprietress said when Richard mentioned he was in town to visit an old friend. "Such a dear lady, but keeps to herself mostly. Lives in that big old house on Maple Street, you can't miss it." Richard's pulse quickened. "Yes, that's right," he lied smoothly. "It's been years since I've seen her." "Has she lived here long?" The woman's brow furrowed in thought. "Oh, must be going on 20 years now. Caused quite a stir when she first arrived. A widow, they said, though no one ever knew much about her past. Took a while for folks around here to warm up to her, but she's a fixture now." 20 years. The timeline fit perfectly with Elizabeth's disappearance. Richard thanked the woman and retreated to his room, his mind racing. He was so close now, so close to unraveling the mystery that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. As night fell, Richard found himself parked across the street from a stately Victorian house on Maple Street. Lights glowed warmly behind lace curtains, and a porch swing creaked gently in the evening breeze. It looked like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting, peaceful and idyllic. How could this possibly be connected to the web of secrets and lies he had uncovered? For hours, Richard sat in his car, debating his next move. Should he march up to the door and demand answers? Wait until morning and approach under the guise of a friendly visit? As the clock on his dashboard ticked past midnight, he realized he was no closer to a decision. Suddenly, movement caught his eye. The front door of the house opened, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. Even in the dim light, Richard's breath caught in his throat. The woman's posture, the way she moved, it was achingly familiar. Before he could think better of it, Richard was out of the car and crossing the street. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would give him away. As he approached the porch steps, the woman turned, alerted by the sound of his footsteps. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Richard looked into eyes he had never thought he'd see again, eyes that had haunted his dreams for 15 years. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. The woman's face, lined now with age but still unmistakably beautiful, drained of color. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. For a long moment, they stood frozen, two ghosts from the past facing each other in the warm glow of the porch light. Then, to Richard's shock, the woman's expression hardened. "I don't know who you think I am," she said, her voice cold and firm, "but my name is Margaret Vasquez. I think you should leave now, before I call the police." Richard staggered back, stunned by the vehemence in her tone. "But, Elizabeth, it's me. It's Richard. How can you?" "I said leave," the woman snapped, her voice rising. "I don't know any Elizabeth, and I certainly don't know you. Go away, or I'll scream." Confused and heartbroken, Richard retreated to his car. As he drove back to his hotel, his mind reeled. It was Elizabeth, he was sure of it. But why had she pretended not to know him? What could have happened to make her react with such hostility? Back in his hotel room, Richard paced restlessly, unable to make sense of the night's events. He had come seeking answers, but had only found more questions. As dawn broke, he made a decision. He couldn't leave Millbrook, not without understanding what was really going on. Over the next few days, Richard embarked on a covert investigation of Margaret Vasquez. He spoke to locals under the guise of an old friend, piecing together the story of the mysterious widow who had appeared in their town 2 decades ago. The picture that emerged was frustratingly incomplete. Margaret was well liked but kept to herself. She volunteered at the local library and was known for her beautiful garden, but few people seemed to know much about her life before Millbrook. Those who did mention her past spoke of a tragic accident, a lost love, but the details were vague and contradictory. On his 3rd day in town, Richard's phone rang. It was Jack. "Rich, where the hell are you?" His friend's voice was urgent. "Alexander's been trying to reach you. There's been some kind of emergency with the wedding preparations." Reality came crashing back. In his obsession with uncovering the truth about Elizabeth, Richard had completely lost track of time. He had missed calls from Alexander, texts from Maria. Guilt washed over him as he realized how his actions must look to his son. I'm on my way back," Richard said, already throwing his belongings into his suitcase. "Tell Alexander I'll be there as soon as I can." As he sped back towards the city, Richard's mind was in turmoil. He was more convinced than ever that Margaret Vasquez was Elizabeth, but her denial had been so vehement, so convincing. And now, his quest for answers had jeopardized his relationship with his son and potentially derailed the wedding preparations. What was he to do? Continue his investigation and risk alienating Alexander? Or let it go, allow the wedding to proceed, knowing that there were still so many unanswered questions? As the city skyline came into view, Richard made a decision. He would put his investigation on hold, at least until after the wedding. He owed it to Alexander to be there for him, to support him in this important moment of his life. But even as he resolved to focus on the wedding, a part of Richard knew that he couldn't let this go entirely. The mystery of Elizabeth's disappearance, her apparent new life as Margaret Vasquez, and the question of how her ring had ended up on Maria's finger. These were puzzles he needed to solve, not just for his own peace of mind, but for Alexander's sake as well. As he pulled into the driveway of his home, Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for the explanations and apologies he would need to make. Whatever secrets lay buried in the past, whatever truths were yet to be uncovered, one thing was clear. The next few weeks leading up to the wedding would be a delicate balancing act between his role as a supportive father and his burning need to uncover the truth. Little did Richard know that his brief absence had set in motion a series of events that would soon bring all of his carefully constructed plans crashing down around him. The truth he sought was closer than he realized, and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Richard Blackwood's return home was met with a storm of emotions and accusations. Alexander paced the study, his face a mask of worry and frustration, while Maria sat quietly in the corner, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Where have you been, Dad?" Alexander demanded as soon as Richard walked through the door. "We've been trying to reach you for days. The venue called, there's a problem with the date, and we needed your help to sort it out." Richard's heart sank. In his obsession with uncovering the truth about Elizabeth, he had neglected his duties as a father and future father-in-law. "I'm so sorry, son," he began, but Alexander cut him off. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Dad. This isn't like you. You've been acting strange ever since the engagement party. What's going on?" For a moment, Richard was tempted to confess everything, his suspicions about Maria, the mysterious reappearance of Elizabeth's ring, his trip to Millbrook. But as he looked at his son's worried face and Maria's tear-stained cheeks, he knew he couldn't burden them with his unproven theories. "I've just been overwhelmed," Richard lied, hating himself for the deception. "Your mother's absence has been weighing on me more than usual, with the wedding approaching. I needed some time to clear my head." Alexander's expression softened. "Dad, you should have said something. We're here for you, you know that, right?" Maria stood up and approached Richard, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "We understand how difficult this must be for you, Mr. Blackwood. If there's anything we can do to help." The kindness in her voice made Richard's guilt even more acute. How could he suspect this young woman of being involved in some grand deception? And yet, the image of Elizabeth? Or was it Margaret? On that porch in Millbrook wouldn't leave his mind. Over the next few days, Richard threw himself into wedding preparations with a fervor that surprised everyone. He was determined to make up for his absence and to push his suspicions to the back of his mind, at least until after the wedding. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A week before the wedding, as Richard was reviewing seating arrangements in his study, his phone buzzed with a message from Jack. "Found something big. Meet me ASAP." Richard's heart raced. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Alexander and Maria had retired hours ago. Quietly, he slipped out of the house and drove to O'Malley's. Jack was already there, a thick folder on the table in front of him. His face was grim as Richard slid into the booth. "What did you find?" Richard asked, his mouth dry with anticipation. Jack pushed the folder across the table. "It's about Maria's father," he said quietly. "Or rather, the man she thinks is her father." Richard's brow furrowed as he opened the folder. Inside were birth certificates, old newspaper clippings, and a series of photographs. As he scanned the documents, his confusion grew. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at Jack. "According to this, Maria's father died before she was born." Jack nodded. "Exactly. The man Maria knows as her father, the one who raised her, isn't her biological father. He married her mother when Maria was just an infant." Richard's mind raced. But what does this have to do with Elizabeth? With the ring? "Look at the date on Maria's birth certificate," Jack urged. Richard's eyes widened as he did the math. This can't be right. If this is correct, Maria would have been conceived around the time of Elizabeth's disappearance. Jack finished for him. "Rich, I think we need to consider the possibility that Maria might be my daughter," Richard whispered, the words feeling strange and impossible on his tongue. The implications of this revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. If Maria was indeed his daughter, it would explain the uncanny familiarity he had felt towards her from the beginning. But it also raised a host of new, troubling questions. "Does Maria know?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. Jack shook his head. "I don't think so. From what I've gathered, her mother kept this secret from everyone, including Maria's stepfather." Richard slumped back in his seat, his mind reeling. "What am I supposed to do with this information, Jack? The wedding is in a week. If this is true, Maria is about to marry her half-brother." "You have to tell them, Rich," Jack said firmly. "I know it's going to be painful, but they have a right to know." Richard nodded numbly, gathering the documents with trembling hands. As he drove home, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Joy at the possibility of having a daughter he never knew existed warred with horror at the thought of the pain this revelation would cause Alexander and Maria. For the next few days, Richard walked around in a daze, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He watched Alexander and Maria as they laughed together over breakfast, as they finalized last-minute wedding details, and his heart broke for the pain he knew he was about to cause them. Finally, 3 days before the wedding, Richard couldn't bear it any longer. He called Alexander and Maria into his study, his heart pounding so hard he was sure they could hear it. "There's something I need to tell you both," he began, his voice shaking. "Something I've only recently discovered myself." Alexander and Maria exchanged worried glances as Richard recounted the story of his investigation, of his suspicions about the ring, and finally, of Jack's discovery about Maria's parentage. As he spoke, Richard watched the color drain from Maria's face. Alexander sat in stunned silence, his hand gripping Maria's so tightly his knuckles were white. When Richard finished, the room was deathly quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then, Maria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This can't be true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, the man who raised me, he's my real father. He has to be." "Maria, I'm so sorry," Richard said, reaching out to her, but she flinched away from his touch. "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You're lying. Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to ruin our wedding?" Before Richard could respond, Maria fled from the room. Alexander stood up slowly, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Is this why you've been acting so strange?" he asked, his voice cold. "You've been investigating Maria, my fiancée?" "Son, I never meant to hurt you," Richard pleaded. "I was just trying to understand why she had your mother's ring. I never imagined." "Save it," Alexander snapped. I can't deal with this right now. I need to find Maria." As Alexander left the study, Richard sank into his chair, feeling as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. He had done what he thought was right, but at what cost? The next few days were a blur of tears, angry outbursts, and tense silences. The wedding was postponed indefinitely as Maria and Alexander grappled with the shocking revelation of their true relationship. Richard watched helplessly as his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. Maria refused to believe the truth at first, clinging desperately to the identity she had known all her life. It wasn't until she confronted her mother, demanding answers, that the full story finally came to light. Maria's mother, overcome with guilt and faced with irrefutable evidence, finally confessed. She had indeed had a brief affair with Richard years ago, shortly before Elizabeth's disappearance. When she discovered she was pregnant, she had been too afraid to tell Richard, especially after the news of Elizabeth's tragic accident. Instead, she had married another man who had lovingly raised Maria as his own. The revelation sent shockwaves through both families. Maria's stepfather was devastated to learn that the daughter he had raised was not biologically his. Alexander oscillated between anger at the deception and heartbreak over the loss of the future he had imagined with Maria. And through it all, Richard grappled with his own tumultuous emotions. The joy of discovering he had a daughter was tempered by the guilt of the pain he had caused and the lingering questions about Elizabeth's fate. As the dust began to settle, Richard knew there was one more truth he needed to uncover. He had to return to Millbrook, to confront the woman he believed to be Elizabeth once and for all. This time, he didn't go alone. Despite their anger and confusion, both Alexander and Maria insisted on accompanying him. They needed answers just as much as he did. The drive to Millbrook was tense, the car filled with an uncomfortable silence. As they pulled up in front of the Victorian house on Maple Street, Richard's heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and dread. To their surprise, the door opened before they could even knock. The woman Richard knew as Margaret Vasquez stood there, her face a mask of resignation. "I've been expecting you," she said softly. "I suppose it's time for the truth to come out." As they settled in the cozy living room, Margaret, or Elizabeth, as they now knew her to be, began her story. She spoke of a life lived in fear, of threats and blackmail that had forced her to fake her own death and abandon her family. "There were people," she explained, her voice trembling, "powerful people who wanted to destroy your father's company, Alexander. They threatened to harm you if I didn't help them. I thought by disappearing, I could protect you both. Richard listened in stunned silence as Elizabeth recounted the elaborate scheme she had been forced to participate in, the years of loneliness and regret, the constant fear of discovery. But the ring, Maria interrupted. How did my grandmother end up with it? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Maria. Your grandmother, she was the only one who knew the truth. She helped me disappear, helped me create this new identity. I gave her the ring as a reminder, a connection to the life I had to leave behind. I never imagined she would pass it on to you. As the full story unfolded, the room was filled with a cacophony of emotions, anger, grief, relief, and confusion all mingled together. Alexander and Maria clung to each other, their recent discovery of their sibling relationship momentarily forgotten in the face of this new, earth-shattering revelation. For Richard, the truth was both a balm and a wound. Elizabeth was alive. The wife he had mourned for so long was sitting before him. But the years of separation, the lies and secrets, had created a chasm between them that seemed almost insurmountable. As night fell, the group sat in exhausted silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The truth was out, but what did it mean for their future? How could they move forward from here? Richard looked around at his family, his son, the daughter he had just discovered, and the wife he had thought lost forever. Despite the pain and confusion, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived lies and separation, tragedy and deception. Surely, together, they could find a way to heal. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth caught Richard's hand. I know I have no right to ask this, she said softly, but, can you ever forgive me? Richard looked into the eyes he had never thought he'd see again. The love he had carried for Elizabeth all these years surged within him, tempered by the pain of their separation. I don't know, he answered honestly. But I'm willing to try. The drive back to the city was quieter than the journey to Millbrook, but it was a different kind of silence. The anger and tension had been replaced by a shared sense of shock and a tentative hope for reconciliation. As they neared home, Alexander spoke up. What do we do now? He asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Richard glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Maria's eyes briefly before looking at his son. We take it one day at a time, he said. We've all been hurt, we've all made mistakes. But we're family. Somehow, we'll find a way through this. Maria nodded, reaching out to squeeze Alexander's hand. The gesture, once romantic, now spoke of a different kind of love and support. We'll figure it out together, she agreed. As they pulled into the driveway of the Blackwood estate, Richard felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The mystery of the ring had been solved, but in its place, a new chapter was beginning. A chapter of healing, of rediscovery, and of a family finding its way back to each other after years of secrets and separation. As they walked into the house together, Richard knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more tears, more difficult conversations, more wounds to heal. But as he looked at Alexander and Maria, at the strength and resilience they had shown in the face of unimaginable revelations, he felt a surge of pride and love. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family. And that, Richard realized, was the greatest gift of all, one far more precious than any ring could ever be. The days following the revelation in Millbrook were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments for the Blackwood family. The grand mansion that had once echoed with wedding preparations now resonated with hushed conversations and occasional outbursts of pent-up feelings. Richard found himself at the center of a storm he had inadvertently created. On one hand, he was overjoyed at the prospect of reuniting with Elizabeth, the love he thought he had lost forever. On the other, he was painfully aware of the hurt and confusion his actions had caused Alexander and Maria. One crisp morning, about a week after their return from Millbrook, Richard sat in his study, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The door creaked open, and he looked up to see Maria hesitantly stepping inside. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Do you have a moment?" Richard's heart clenched at the formality in her tone. This young woman, who he now knew to be his daughter, still felt like a stranger. Of course, Maria. Please, come in. And, you can call me Richard, if you'd like. Maria nodded, perching on the edge of a leather armchair. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, neither quite sure how to bridge the chasm of years and secrets that separated them. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about my mom, I mean, Elizabeth. About the life I could have had. Richard leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Maria, I want you to know that if I had known, if I had even suspected that you were my daughter, I would have moved heaven and earth to be part of your life. A tear slid down Maria's cheek. I believe you, but it doesn't change the fact that I grew up without you. That the man I called Dad for my entire life isn't really my father. That the future I had planned with Alexander. Her voice broke on the last word. Richard's heart ached for her. He wanted nothing more than to gather her in his arms, to comfort her as a father should. But he knew he hadn't earned that right yet. I know it's a lot to process, he said gently. And I know that no amount of apologizing can make up for the years we've lost. But Maria, if you're willing, I'd like the chance to get to know you. To be a part of your life, in whatever way you're comfortable with. Maria looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I'd like that, she said softly. But I don't know how. Everything's so complicated now. As if on cue, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of concern and determination. Sorry to interrupt, he said, his eyes darting between Richard and Maria. But I think we all need to talk. As a family. The word family hung in the air, its meaning now forever altered for all of them. Richard nodded, gesturing for Alexander to join them. As his son settled into a chair next to Maria, Richard couldn't help but notice the way they unconsciously leaned towards each other, seeking comfort in their shared confusion. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Alexander began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. About us, about the wedding, about everything that's happened. And I've come to a decision. Maria tensed visibly, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. Alexander took a deep breath before continuing. I think we should go ahead with the wedding. A shocked silence fell over the room. Richard stared at his son in disbelief, while Maria's eyes widened in a mixture of hope and confusion. Alexander, Richard said carefully, I know this is difficult, but you and Maria, your siblings. The wedding can't. Not our wedding, Dad, Alexander interrupted. Your wedding, yours and Elizabeth's. Richard felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. What? Alexander leaned forward, his eyes blazing with an intensity Richard had never seen before. Think about it. You and Elizabeth were torn apart by circumstances beyond your control. You've spent 15 years believing she was dead, and she's spent 15 years in hiding, thinking she was protecting us. Don't you think you both deserve a second chance at happiness? Maria nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. He's right, Richard. After everything that's happened, maybe this is the universe's way of giving you both another shot at love. Richard's mind reeled. The thought of remarrying Elizabeth, of reclaiming the life that had been stolen from them, was almost too much to comprehend. But what about you two? He asked, looking between Alexander and Maria. After everything you've been through. We'll be okay, Dad, Alexander said, reaching out to take Maria's hand. The gesture was no longer that of a lover, but of a brother comforting his sister. It'll take time, but we're family. We'll figure it out. Maria squeezed Alexander's hand, then turned to Richard with a determined look in her eyes. And maybe this can be a new beginning for all of us. A chance to be the family we should have been all along. As Richard looked at the two young people before him, he felt a surge of pride and love so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. Despite the pain and confusion of the past weeks, they had found the strength to think of others, to seek a path forward. I don't know what to say, Richard admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Say yes, Dad, Alexander urged. Go to Elizabeth. Tell her you want to start over. With trembling hands, Richard reached for his phone. As he dialed Elizabeth's number, he felt as if he was standing on the precipice of a new life, one filled with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The Blackwood mansion, which had so recently been prepared for one wedding, was now being readied for another. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was still tension, still moments of awkwardness and pain, but underlying it all was a sense of hope, of a family finding its way back to each other. Elizabeth moved back into the mansion, her return causing a stir among the household staff who had long believed her dead. Richard watched with a mixture of joy and trepidation as she reacquainted herself with the home she had left behind so many years ago. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Richard found Elizabeth standing in the garden, her fingers gently caressing the petals of a rose bush she had planted in what seemed like another lifetime. "I never thought I'd see these bloom again," she said softly as Richard approached. He stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence but not quite touching. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice husky with emotion, "are you sure about this? About us?" She turned to face him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Richard, I've spent 15 years regretting the choice I made. 15 years wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to stand up to the people threatening our family. I know we can't erase the past, but if you're willing to try, I want nothing more than to build a future with you." Richard reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "I love you, Elizabeth. I never stopped loving you. But we can't ignore the pain our separation has caused. Alexander, Maria." Elizabeth nodded, leaning into his touch. "I know, and I want to make it right, Richard. I want to be there for them, to be the mother they both deserve. It won't be easy, but I'm ready to face whatever comes, as long as we're together." As they stood there in the fading light, Richard felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and emotional hurdles. But for the first time in years, he felt truly hopeful about the future. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. The Blackwood mansion was a hive of activity, with florists, caterers, and decorators putting the finishing touches on the elegant arrangements. In his study, Richard adjusted his bow tie, his hands shaking slightly with nerves and excitement. A knock at the door drew his attention, and he turned to see Alexander and Maria entering, both looking stunning in their formal attire. "You ready for this, Dad?" Alexander asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Richard took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be. How's Elizabeth?" Maria's eyes sparkled with warmth. "She's beautiful, Richard, and just as nervous as you are." As they made their way to the garden where the ceremony would take place, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Despite all the pain and confusion of the past months, his family had found a way to come together, to support each other through this new chapter of their lives. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotions for Richard. As Elizabeth walked down the aisle, radiant in a simple but elegant gown, he felt tears prick at his eyes. The years seemed to fall away, and he was transported back to their first wedding, full of hope and dreams for the future. But this time was different. This time, they stood before their children, before friends who had supported them through the darkest of times. This time, they exchanged vows with the wisdom of years lived and hardships overcome, with a love that had endured separation and heartbreak. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the gathered crowd erupted in applause. Richard looked out over the sea of faces, his heart swelling with joy as he saw Alexander and Maria cheering alongside everyone else. The reception that followed was a celebration not just of Richard and Elizabeth's renewed love, but of a family reunited. Richard watched with pride as Alexander and Maria moved among the guests, their bond as siblings growing stronger with each passing day. As the evening wore on, Richard found a quiet moment alone with Elizabeth on the balcony overlooking the gardens. The sounds of the party drifted up from below, a joyous backdrop to their conversation. "I never thought I'd have this again," Elizabeth said softly, leaning into Richard's embrace. "A family, a home, you." Richard tightened his arms around her. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for," he murmured. "But we have the rest of our lives to do it." Elizabeth turned in his arms, her eyes serious. "Richard, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Richard felt a flicker of apprehension. "What is it?" The people who threatened our family, who forced me into hiding. I know who they were. And I think it's time we did something about it. Richard's eyes widened. Elizabeth, are you sure? After all this time? She nodded, determination etched on her face. I'm sure. For years, I lived in fear of what they might do if I came forward. But now, seeing our family together, seeing how strong we are, I'm not afraid anymore. It's time for the whole truth to come out. As Elizabeth began to share the details of the conspiracy that had torn their family apart, Richard listened with growing anger and resolve. The names she mentioned were powerful, influential people in the business world, people who had continued to thrive while his family suffered. By the time Elizabeth finished her story, Richard's mind was already racing with plans. We'll need help, he said. Legal help, investigative help. This won't be easy. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. I know, but we're not alone anymore, Richard. We have each other, we have our children. And we have the truth on our side. As they rejoined the party, Richard's heart was light despite the weight of Elizabeth's revelations. They had overcome so much already: distance, time, misunderstandings, and pain. This new challenge, daunting as it was, felt like just another obstacle they would face together. Looking around at the smiling faces of their guests, at Alexander and Maria laughing together by the dance floor, Richard felt a surge of determination. He had his family back, against all odds. And he would do whatever it took to protect them, to ensure that the people who had tried to destroy them faced justice. The ring that had started this whole journey glinted on Elizabeth's finger, catching the light as she raised her glass for a toast. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of their enduring love, of secrets revealed and a family reunited. As the night drew to a close, Richard and Elizabeth stood hand in hand, watching as the last of the guests departed. The future stretched out before them, filled with promise and challenges in equal measure. But this time, they would face it together, stronger for the trials they had overcome. The mystery of the ring had been solved, but a new chapter was just beginning. A chapter of justice, of healing, and of a family determined to make up for lost time. And as Richard looked at Elizabeth, at the love shining in her eyes, he knew that whatever came next, they were ready to face it. Together, they turned and walked back into the house, ready to begin the next phase of their extraordinary journey. The Blackwood family saga was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The honeymoon period for Richard and Elizabeth Blackwood was short-lived. Within days of their renewed vows, the couple found themselves embroiled in a high-stakes game of corporate espionage and long-buried secrets. The names Elizabeth had revealed on their wedding night belonged to some of the most powerful figures in the business world, people who would stop at nothing to keep their misdeeds hidden. Richard sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of documents and financial reports. His eyes were bloodshot from hours of poring over the evidence Elizabeth had meticulously gathered during her years in hiding. Across from him, Jack Murphy, his old friend and investigator, whistled low as he flipped through a particularly damning file. "This is dynamite, Rich," Jack said, shaking his head in disbelief. "If even half of this is true, we're looking at a conspiracy that goes back decades. Embezzlement, insider trading, even. Christ, is this saying what I think it's saying?" Richard nodded grimly. "Murder. They didn't just threaten our family, Jack. They've been eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth for years." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elizabeth entered, carrying a tray of coffee. Her face was drawn with worry, but her eyes burned with determination. "Any progress?" she asked, setting the tray down. Richard reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're getting there. But Elizabeth, are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this? These people, they're dangerous. If we do this, there's no going back." Elizabeth's jaw set in a firm line. "I've been running from them for 15 years, Richard. I've missed out on watching our son grow up, on being there for our daughter. No more. It's time they faced justice for what they've done." As if on cue, Alexander and Maria appeared in the doorway. They had insisted on being part of this fight, despite Richard and Elizabeth's initial reluctance to involve them. "We found something," Alexander said, his voice tight with excitement. He was clutching a laptop, which he set down on Richard's desk. Maria and I have been digging into the financial records of Crowley Industries. Look at this. The group huddled around the computer as Alexander pulled up a series of spreadsheets. At first glance, the numbers seemed innocuous, but as Alexander walked them through his findings, a pattern began to emerge. See these transactions? Maria pointed to a column of figures. They're being funneled through a series of shell companies. But if you trace them back to their source, they lead straight to the personal accounts of Jonathan Crowley and his associates, Richard finished, his eyes widening. The very people who threatened our family. Jack let out a low whistle. This is good, kids. Really good. But it's not enough on its own. We need hard evidence of their involvement in the threats against your family, and in the other incidents. Elizabeth's face paled slightly at the implication, but she squared her shoulders. I think I know where we might find that evidence. But getting to it won't be easy. Over the next few weeks, the Blackwood mansion became the headquarters for their clandestine investigation. Richard's study was transformed into a war room, with boards covered in photos, documents, and strings connecting various pieces of evidence. The family worked tirelessly, each bringing their unique skills to the table. Alexander's business acumen proved invaluable in entangling the complex web of financial transactions. Maria, with her background in law, pored over legal documents, searching for loopholes and inconsistencies. Jack used his contacts in law enforcement to gather information discreetly, while Richard and Elizabeth focused on piecing together the larger picture. As they delved deeper into the conspiracy, the true scope of the corruption began to come into focus. It wasn't just about threats and financial crimes. The tentacles of this organization reached into politics, law enforcement, and even the judiciary. One evening, as they were reviewing their progress, Elizabeth suddenly gasped. "Richard, look at this," she said, her voice trembling. She pointed to a name on one of the documents, Judge Harold Simmons. Richard's brow furrowed. "The judge who presided over the inquest into your death. What about him?" "Look at his financial records," Elizabeth urged. "The month after he ruled my death an accident, he received a substantial payment from one of Crowley's shell companies." The implications were staggering. If a judge had been compromised, how deep did this corruption truly go? As the days turned into weeks, the Blackwoods found themselves in a race against time. They knew it was only a matter of time before Crowley and his associates realized they were being investigated. The family took precautions, installing new security systems, varying their routines, communicating only through encrypted channels. Despite the tension and the long hours, there was a silver lining to their shared mission. Working together towards a common goal had brought the family closer than ever. Richard watched with pride as Alexander and Maria's sibling bond grew stronger each day. And his relationship with Elizabeth deepened as they faced this challenge side by side, making up for lost time. The breakthrough they had been waiting for came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Jack burst into the study, waving a flash drive triumphantly. "We got him," he announced, his face split in a wide grin. "One of my contacts in the police force came through. This drive contains recordings of Crowley and his cronies discussing the threats against your family, Elizabeth. And there's more, there's evidence linking them to at least 3 unsolved murders over the past decade." The room erupted in a flurry of activity. This was the smoking gun they needed, irrefutable proof of Crowley's crimes. But they knew they had to move fast. Once they went public with this information, Crowley and his associates would stop at nothing to discredit or silence them. "We need to get this to the authorities," Richard said, his mind racing. "But not just any authorities. We need someone we can trust, someone beyond Crowley's influence." It was Maria who came up with the solution. "I have a friend from law school," she said. "She works for the FBI now, in their white-collar crime division. If we can get this evidence to her, she can initiate a federal investigation." The plan was set in motion. Under the cover of night, Richard and Jack would drive to the nearest FBI field office to deliver the evidence in person. Elizabeth, Alexander, and Maria would stay behind to coordinate with their legal team and prepare for the media storm that was sure to follow. As Richard prepared to leave, he pulled Elizabeth into a tight embrace. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't lose you again." Richard kissed her softly. "I'll be back before you know it. And when this is over, we'll finally be free to live the life we've always dreamed of." The drive to the FBI office was tense, every shadow on the road seeming to hold potential danger. But they made it without incident, and within hours, the wheels of justice were set in motion. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Federal agents descended on Crowley Industries, armed with search warrants and subpoenas. The news broke like a tsunami, dominating headlines across the country. Corporate conspiracy exposed. Millionaire's missing wife returns to uncover decades of corruption. Justice Department launches largest white-collar crime investigation in decades. As the Blackwoods had anticipated, Crowley and his associates fought back viciously. They deployed armies of lawyers, launched smear campaigns in the media, and even attempted to intimidate witnesses. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the paper trail too damning. One by one, Crowley's co-conspirators began to turn on each other, hoping for leniency in exchange for testimony. The house of cards was collapsing, and Jonathan Crowley found himself at the center of a maelstrom of his own making. Throughout it all, the Blackwood family stood strong, presenting a united front to the world. Richard and Elizabeth became the faces of the fight against corporate corruption, their story of love and perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds captivating the public imagination. Alexander and Maria, initially hesitant to step into the spotlight, found themselves becoming advocates in their own right. Alexander used his business expertise to explain the complex financial crimes to the public, while Maria worked tirelessly with victims' rights groups, giving a voice to those who had been silenced by Crowley's organization. As the legal proceedings dragged on, life slowly began to return to a new normal for the Blackwoods. The mansion, once a hub of frenetic investigative activity, gradually transformed back into a home. Family dinners became a nightly ritual, a time for them to reconnect and support each other away from the prying eyes of the media. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Richard looked at the faces of his loved ones and felt a surge of emotion. "I want to thank you all," he said, his voice husky with feeling. "For your courage, your perseverance, your unwavering support. I know these past months haven't been easy, but I couldn't be prouder of how we've faced this challenge together." Elizabeth reached for his hand, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "We're a family," she said simply. "This is what families do. They stand by each other, no matter what." Alexander raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And to justice." As they clinked their glasses together, Richard felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, the trial was looming, and there were sure to be more challenges to face. But looking at the strong, resilient individuals around him, he knew they could weather any storm. Months passed, and finally, the day of reckoning arrived. The courthouse was a media circus, reporters jostling for position as the Blackwoods made their way inside. Richard held Elizabeth's hand tightly as they walked up the steps, Alexander and Maria flanking them protectively. The trial was grueling, a marathon of testimony and cross-examination that stretched on for weeks. But as the prosecution presented its case, meticulously laying out the evidence the Blackwoods had worked so hard to uncover, it became clear that justice would prevail. On the day the verdict was to be announced, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Richard sat with his family in the front row, his heart pounding as the jury filed in. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, he felt Elizabeth's hand tighten in his. In the case of the United States versus Jonathan Crowley and Associates, on the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendants guilty. A collective gasp went up from the courtroom as the foreman continued, reading out guilty verdict after guilty verdict. Racketeering, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and in Crowley's case, solicitation of murder. As the judge read out the sentences, decades in federal prison for Crowley and his top lieutenants, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. After years of running, of hiding, of fighting, justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by a sea of reporters and flashing cameras, the Blackwoods stood together, their faces a mixture of relief and determination. "Today, justice has been served," Richard said, his voice carrying over the clamor of the crowd. But our work is not done. We will continue to fight for transparency in business, for accountability in our institutions, and for justice for all those who have been victimized by corporate greed. As they made their way through the crowd, Richard felt a tugging on his sleeve. He turned to see a young woman, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "My father worked for Crowley. He tried to blow the whistle years ago, and, well, we never saw him again. What you've done here, it means everything to families like mine." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of all the lives that had been destroyed by Crowley's greed, of all the families torn apart. "We did it for people like your father," he said, clasping the woman's hand. "And for our own family. No one should have to suffer the way we all have." As they drove home that evening, the car was filled with a mixture of exhaustion and elation. They had won, but the victory had come at a great cost. Years of their lives had been consumed by this fight, relationships strained, opportunities missed. But as Richard looked around at his family, at Elizabeth, her face serene with the peace of long-sought justice, at Alexander, his eyes bright with the passion of a man who had found his calling, at Maria, her expression filled with the quiet strength of someone who had overcome great adversity, he knew that they had gained far more than they had lost. The ring that had started it all glinted on Elizabeth's finger, catching the last rays of the setting sun. It was no longer a symbol of loss and mystery, but a testament to the enduring power of love and truth. Through all the trials and tribulations, it had led them here, to justice, to reunion, to a second chance at happiness. As they pulled up to the mansion, Richard turned to his family. "What do you say we take a vacation?" he suggested. "Somewhere far away from courtrooms and cameras. Just the four of us." The idea was met with enthusiastic agreement. They had fought their battle, had seen justice done. Now it was time to heal, to reconnect, to build the family bonds that had been denied them for so long. As they entered the house, already excitedly discussing potential destinations, Richard hung back for a moment. He looked at the home that had once felt so empty, now filled with the warmth of family and the promise of a brighter future. The mystery of the ring had been solved, the truth uncovered, justice served. But the greatest mystery, the intricate, beautiful complexity of family, of love that endures against all odds, was one that Richard looked forward to exploring for the rest of his days. With a smile, he closed the door behind him, ready to embark on the next chapter of their extraordinary journey. The Blackwood family saga had taken an unexpected turn, but as they had proven time and time again, together they could face anything life threw their way. And so, as night fell on the Blackwood estate, a new day dawned for the family within. A day filled with hope, with love, and with the unshakable bond of a family that had overcome the impossible.